what the Prime Minister is having to deal with is a legacy of the expenses scandal, and the way that that stripped away a layer of trust in politicians which has never really been repaired or recovered. So in his efforts to try and overcome this scandal, he's starting from a different place than were the expenses scandal not to have happened in the first place.
Now, it's been another bruising week for the Prime Minister, under pressure over the Mandelson scandal, raising questions about judgment and transparency in government. It's also a reminder of another moment when British politics was consumed by scandal, the MP's expenses scandal.
So scandalous.
The expenses scandal just keeps on going.
I want to apologise on behalf of politicians, on behalf of all parties, for what has happened.
Look, I understand entirely why the public hates this, right? The system is wrong. It needs to be changed.
Mrs. Beckett, are you going to pay back the £72,000 that you've taken?
No, I'm not.
Please allow me to say to the men and women of the United Kingdom that we have let you down very badly indeed.
First, it was floating duck houses, moat cleaning and blue movies. This time, we hear about a bell tower, garlic presses and bin bags.
I'm very angry about what's happened, and that's why I put forward proposals not just to reform the MP's expenses system, but to reform the way that Parliament works and the link between Parliament and the people of this country.
Well, right now we're going to look back at how that scandal unfolded, how it felt inside Westminster at the time, and whether today's government should be worried about history repeating itself. Well, Phil Webster was political editor at the Times during that scandal. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. And Roland Watson took over as political editor for the 2010 election. He's now a comment editor at the Times. Hello, Roland.
Morning.
I owe you a column. I'll get it to you as soon as possible, I promise. Look, it's a great pleasure to have both of you here. Roland, looking at the pressure on Keir Starmer this week, are all scandals the same scandal? Does this all look very familiar in terms of the sort of the tone and the atmosphere?
Well, in terms of the expenses scandal, I mean that was a plague on everyone's house, and so this is clearly different. This is a scandal for a sitting government solely, and to some extent, what the Prime Minister is having to deal with is a legacy of the expenses scandal, and the way that that stripped away a layer of trust in politicians which has never really been repaired or recovered. So in his efforts to try and overcome this scandal, he's starting from a different place than were the expenses scandal not to have happened in the first place.
A much worse place as well. Phil, back in 2009, when the expenses story first began to break, did anyone grasp how huge it was going to be, how kind of sort of like generational defining it was going to be?
No, we didn't. It all started when a disc was, we think, stolen from the expenses department, and it was hawked around various newspapers. And full disclosure, we had the opportunity at the Times, and for legal reasons, I think we didn't go ahead with it. And when the Telegraph first ran with it, it seemed pretty tame, and then day after day it seemed to get worse. And as Roland says, it was a plague on all their houses. It wasn't a case of where the Prime Minister of the day could attack the opposition, which is often a way out of a problem. You unite your party by attacking the other side. Well, that was impossible on this occasion because they were all up to their necks in it. And in fact, 3 Labour MPs did go to prison over it. Gordon Brown himself, he did nothing wrong at all, but it became public that he'd shared his the cleaning bill with his brother, who also lived in London at the time, and then Gordon would pay his brother. And when Brown set up new rules under Sir Thomas Legge to see who should be paying back expenses, well, Legge decided that Gordon himself should pay back 12,000. So you had even the Prime Minister of the day embroiled, and it's a much different scandal to the one we've been enjoying or not enjoying this week.
Roland, even though it did affect both main parties, indeed all parties equally, I think the last major resignation was even well into the next government when David Laws went, which is effectively an expenses scandal resignation as well. But in that sort of situation, when it is a plague on all your houses type situation, doesn't the government suffer more because the government is sort of held accountable for all of politics?
Well, probably. I mean, if you think of some of the more memorable symbols of that time, the duck house, the moat, what have you, they tended to be claims by Tory MPs.
Yeah.
But the government, as incumbents, they are the ones against whom voters were able to take their anger out on at the next election. The extent to which it was responsible for Labour's defeat, I think, is debatable. Britain was coming out of the financial crisis, and Brown had a pretty good story to tell on the financial crisis as the man who saved not only the City of London but the world. But that was hard to make. That was a hard argument to prosecute when most voters had spent much of the previous 12 months consuming details about MPs' malfeasance.
Moats and Duck Islands. Phil, I mean, one hears a lot at the moment about the huge kind of antipathy, the public antipathy there is towards politicians, and the Mandelson story just sort of, it seems to exemplify that. Huge anger, huge distrust. What was it like? How are people like Gordon Brown, members of the government, how are they reacting at the time at this sort of wave of public hatred? How did they feel about it? Were they shocked? Were they frightened?
They were shocked. They all faffed around. The only person they could unite to have a go at, of course, was the Commons Speaker at the time, Michael Martin, they tabled a vote of no confidence in Michael Martin because in all his deliberations in Westminster, he was more concerned about the leak of the expenses than what the expenses showed. Showed MPs misbehaving, claiming for ridiculous things like dog walking, and all of that. So they were shocked. And of course, they realised at the time this was going to play into the way they were regarded when the election came round, even though MPs of all parties were involved.
Roland, you were sceptical that it had played a major role in the result of the 2010 election, but the mood after the 2010 election, when there was a coalition government, this idea of Britain moving into political territory we sort of hadn't been in before, sort of, fresh and optimistic, the Rose Garden, all that kind of stuff, did a lot of that come out of the sort of the background, the backdrop of this sort of dirtiness of expenses, do you think?
I think a little bit. I think that the coalition was a brand new thing. We hadn't seen it. It came after many years of Labour rule, 17 years of Labour rule, so there was bound to be a sense of freshness anyway. But we did see two party leaders putting their differences aside and hammering out what looked like and what was a durable agreement that lasted, heavens forfend, a full 5 years. So there was a freshness to it. And I think your mention of David Laws is also instructive as well. That was the sort of a scandalette, shall we say, a middle gear scandal, if you like, which might have been brushed under the carpet in other times, but he resigned absolutely on the spot, and he was a key, he was Nick Clegg's right-hand man, and Clegg was not I would say happy, but saw that he had to go. He absolutely had to go straight away. So that was indicative itself of a new kind of politics.
Yeah, I mean, Phil, has politics ever got over it? I mean, are scandals today? You look at something like this today. Is this still really in the shadow of the expenses scandal? It's still in this sort of atmosphere that politicians aren't and don't deserve to be trusted, and anything that they can be suspected of, they've probably done.
Absolutely, and when you hear people talking, if they're talking about MPs in the pub or wherever, it still goes back to the expenses. They say, MPs are in it for their own good. They're claiming for duck houses, this, that, and the other. During that period, of course, I was reminded of this with everything that happened over the last week. James Purnell resigned from the government in 2009, hoping that would precipitate a challenge against Gordon Brown. And one of the reasons was the feeling around the place, nobody likes us, we've got to change. And of course, the same thing happened in 2009, happened this last week. The ministers were all asked to go out and defend Gordon Brown. And guess who organised that? Peter Mandelson, who had been brought back by Brown the year before. And he was getting on to other ministers and saying, you know, you've got to support Gordon. And of course, David Miliband, whom everybody expected would follow James Purnell when he resigned, kept quiet. We never saw him until he challenged for the election, for the leadership, and failed in 2010.
Roland.
Well, I think one indication of how the expenses scandal has changed politics and Westminster is to think back to the Bernie Ecclestone scandal, which, if you remember, was in the first year of Blair's government, 97, when the government was caught red-handed taking an enormous sum of money, £1 million, into Labour Party coffers, basically to change government policy. It was absolutely cash for a policy change. And Blair, partly because it was in his first year, partly because he was Tony Blair, was able to go on the telly on a Sunday morning and say, deliver an apology, and look down the camera lens and say words to the effect of, but I'm a pretty straight kind of guy, you can trust me on this, and get away with it. Now, would Keir Starmer have been able to do the same in the same sort of circumstances? Was he as sort of quick on his feet and persuasive? Possibly not. Would Tony Blair have been able to get through the Mandelson affair had it happened early in his premiership? And I think you can argue that he may well have done.
Roland Watson and Phil Webster, thank you both very much indeed. Let's speak now to Jill Rutter, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Jill, good morning.
Good morning, Hugo.
So, Keir Starmer, he entered Downing Street promising to clean up politics. Would you say this looks a lot like he's failed?
I think he's been very slow off the mark. It was very surprising, I think, that he didn't make cleaning up government a sort of very early announcement. We finally saw some stuff at the end of last year, and then with Darren Jones this week talking about that. But I also think that he shot his reputation for that pretty quickly with some of those early, quite minor, in some ways quite trivial scandals, but the sort of freebie gate stuff was, I think, not what people were expecting from someone who had made so much of the fact that he was very different from the previous government, which characterised as quite sleazy, on the take, etc. And those seemed like, very sort of, poor missteps, and maybe those were early indications of the judgment problems that have come to dog the Prime Minister so badly.
So, look, he's now building a new team in Downing Street. He's going to have new advisors. They're not in the limelight, but they're, of course, important. Why does having the right Chief of Staff, the right Director of Communications, really matter? I mean, why is that so important? Because you'd think, some people might think these are just sort of mechanical roles that anyone could do.
Well, the trouble is the Prime Minister can't do absolutely everything. So he needs to have people who can critically sort of support him to make the decisions he needs, but also connect into the official machine, connect to the wider world, and actually convey what the Prime Minister wants, because the Prime Minister has limited time. He's very preoccupied with things. So you need people who can identify what really matters, what really needs the Prime Minister's attention, help give him advice to make sure that he asks the right questions, but also can kick the vast other machine that the Prime Minister's overseeing, if you like, into doing what the Prime Minister wants. So those are really critical roles. And I think those work best when you have people who've a long established track record of working with the Prime Minister, which is one reason why prolonged churn is so problematic here, because you need people who can plausibly speak on the Prime Minister's behalf with credibility and actually know and can anticipate what he would be concerned about and where they don't need to bother him. And that's why the most successful occupants of those roles have been people like, Jonathan Powell and Alistair Campbell under Tony Blair, who had very long track records of working with him. And then, if you like, Ed Llewellyn working with David Cameron lasted the full term. And where we've seen Number 10 work much less well is when we've had sort of, who's the Chief of Staff today? is there another director of communications this week? Because they just don't have time to build that personal relationship.
Yeah. Jill Rutter, thank you very much indeed. Jill is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.